howitzers. Once the Russians withdrew from Snake Island, their position in the northwestern Black Sea was considerably compromised. And this was only exacerbated for the Russians by the fact that the Ukrainians received further improvements to their ground-based anti-ship missile capability, things like the Harpoon anti-ship cruise missile, which was transferred to them by allies. So out to about 150 kilometers, the northwestern Black Sea becomes a very risky place for Russian surface combatants to operate. And the Ukrainians also enjoyed subsequent successes in retaking the Boyko Towers, energy installations, which the Russians had used to maintain situational awareness in the region.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are speaking to Dr. Sidharth Kaushal from the defence and security think tank, RUSI. Dr. Kaushal's expertise include the impact of technology on maritime doctrine and the role of sea power. Dr. Kaushal, welcome to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the news that's been reported by Ukraine's military that it has delivered another severe blow to Russia's navy in the Black Sea by sinking a landing vessel off the south coast of Crimea. Can you tell us a bit more about this vessel and how great a loss it is?
Sure. So the vessel sunk in question was a Rapucha class landing vessel. What these vessels have represented for the Black Sea Fleet, both in this conflict and actually in previous conflicts, is essentially a kind of workhorse capability that can be used to that has quite a significant carrying capacity and can be used to transport goods. You know, it was designed to carry things like armored vehicles, but in principle can be used to carry a variety of goods. Now, because the Russians are reliant on a few different lines of supply to Crimea, the railroads running through Melitopol, the Kerch Strait Bridge, and actually the Rapucha class vessels of the Black Sea Fleet. The loss of one of these vessels, especially considering it's the second of them to be lost by the Black Sea Fleet, does impact Russia's logistics in the region.
And this is the latest in a series of strikes which have helped Ukraine break Russia's blockade of the Black Sea. Can you just talk us through how this one was targeted exactly? What was used? It was sea drones, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the Ukrainians appear to have used an uncrewed surface vessel to target the LST. So these USVs have certain advantages in terms of both range, so around 450 nautical miles, and they carry quite a heavy payload, around 300 kilograms, over 300 kilograms. The combination, which makes them quite a useful means for the Ukrainians to strike targets at reach, especially at ranges and in areas where the use of an anti-ship cruise missile might not be possible, either because they're more range limited or because the adversary has quite robust air defenses. So the Ukrainians appear to have been using these capabilities to kind of steadily degrade not necessarily the combat vessels of the Black Sea Fleet, but some of the secondary vessels upon which their ability to act, the fleet's ability to act as a logistical supply capability for the Russian military depends, as well as things like fixed infrastructure.
And how many are they Magura V5 attack drones? It's thought. How many does Ukraine have, and how else is it using them?
So it's not clear precisely how many of these USVs the Ukrainians have produced, although it would appear that the production costs are quite low, sort of running into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. So they can be built at a faster rate than, for example, more complex capabilities like anti-ship cruise missiles. The Ukrainians initially used their USVs to target combat vessels. So you remember last year they used a slightly more primitive predecessor to what's been used in this instance to target the Admiral Essen, the Russian frigate. They then seem to have shifted approach, largely because the Russians, at least when they were using combat vessels, were reasonably effective in terms of countering these uncrewed surface vessels. A combination of naval gunfire, barriers, and things like helicopters were able to eliminate them at a fairly rapid kilter. So instead, it seems the Ukrainians have shifted to targeting secondary assets. So later in the year, they targeted the Russian intelligence, or attempted to target the Russian intelligence gathering vessel, the Ivan Kurs, at quite a significant distance from Crimea. Subsequent attacks took place on patrol vessels, and of course, on the Reprucha class landing ships. So one use of USVs has been to eliminate some of the more lightly armed capabilities that the Black Sea Fleet has deployed. Patrol vessels, corvettes like the Tarantul class, and landing ships, which may not be as important to the direct combat role of the fleet as larger, more capable vessels, but which are actually important for a range of functions from anti-saboteur activities around Crimean coastlines to, as we said, that logistical function that the Black Sea Fleet plays. The second role in which USVs have been quite important for the Ukrainians is as a means of sabotage against fixed infrastructure. You might remember that an uncrewed surface vessel was used in one of the more prominent attacks on the Kerch Bridge as well.
Can you just remind us, and if we rewind to the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the big wins that Ukraine has had in the Black Sea?
Sure. So, at the outset of the invasion, I think it might have been presumed that the Russian Black Sea Fleet would have effectively dominated the northwestern Black Sea. The Ukrainian Navy had, first of all, following the loss of Crimea in 2014, the Ukrainians had lost quite a bit of their naval capacity, and what remained of it was, to a large extent, destroyed at the war's outset. It was also presumed that some of the anti-ship capabilities in which the Ukrainian government had been investing over the previous decade, things like the Neptune anti-ship cruise missile, were not ready for combat operations yet. So early on in the war, we see the Russian Black Sea Fleet playing a very front-footed role in the region. You even see things like coastal bombardments off Odessa and early reconnaissance activity by the Russian naval infantry in the area. The sinking of the Moskva is, I think, the first major setback for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, of course. The Ukrainians do actually get an operational Neptune battery to successfully fire cruise missiles, which sink the Moskva. And that's quite important because it denies the Black Sea Fleet its only wide area air defense capability, which is especially relevant because in the context of the closure of the Turkish Straits, the Russians can replace the Moskva with a similar capability from one of their other regional fleets. Now, following this, there was an attempt by the Russians to turn Snake Island into a sort of floating air defense platform. This faltered largely because the Ukrainians proved quite successful at cutting off the logistical supply lines upon which the Russian garrison on Snake Island depended, destroying things like the Cerna-class landing boats, which the Russians were using to resupply Snake Island, as well as subjecting the island itself to quite a heavy sort of air bombardment and subsequently bombardment by ground-based Caesar howitzers. Once the Russians withdrew from Snake Island, their position in the northwestern Black Sea was considerably compromised. And this was only exacerbated for the Russians by the fact that the Ukrainians received further improvements to their ground-based anti-ship missile capability, things like the Harpoon anti-ship cruise missile, which was transferred to them by allies. So out to about 150 kilometers, the northwestern Black Sea becomes a very risky place for Russian surface combatants to operate. And the Ukrainians also enjoyed subsequent successes in retaking the Boyko Towers energy installations, which the Russians had used to maintain situational awareness in the region. But the Black Sea Fleet's approach, to some extent, adapted to the new reality of the situation, and it continued to play three important roles for the Russians. The first was reinforcing the blockade of Odessa, both in terms of seeding minefields, but also in terms of actually bombarding vessels ashore in Odessa with long-range caliber cruise missiles and conducting strikes against secondary sort of facilities, riverine ports like Izmail and Reni, which the Ukrainians were using to try to circumvent the blockade of Odessa by other means. The second thing the Russian Black Sea Fleet has continued to do is contribute to the Russian air and missile campaign against Ukraine. The fleet remains the primary instrument for the delivery of Caliber cruise missiles, the 3M14, which is one of Russia's more modern missile variants. And the final role the Russian Black Sea Fleet continued to play was as one of the lines of logistical support for the wider Russian war effort. Now, in recent months, we've seen actually the Ukrainians enjoy some success in disrupting the Black Sea Fleet's efforts to support these three functions. So firstly, the clearance of a relatively safe channel for grain exports that runs to a great extent through the waters of NATO members, combined with the sea denial capabilities that Ukraine fields, has made it possible for the Ukrainians to renew exports from Odessa, not necessarily to pre-war levels, but to a level that hasn't really been seen since the grain deal with Russia collapsed. The second thing Ukraine has done increasingly with air-launched missiles like Storm Shadow is pressure the Black Sea Fleet in its home base of Sevastopol. And we've seen this with, successful strikes on one of the fleet's Kilo-class submarines while it was in Sevastopol, as well as, of course, a strike on the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters. What this has done is it's forced the fleet to disperse and operate from secondary facilities like Feodosia and Novorossiysk, which are safer, but the need to operate in this manner has slowed the tempo of the fleet's activities and thereby limited its contribution to the wider war effort. And the final thing we've seen is these harassing uncrewed surface vessel attacks, which, although many of them end in failure, use a relatively cheap expendable capability to attack what you might describe as, the soft ribs of the fleet, not necessarily its combatants, but rather secondary vessels, patrol vessels, as well as some smaller combatants like the Tarantul class, but most importantly, excuse me, logistical vessels and as we've mentioned, fixed infrastructure. So that would be kind of a brief canter through the war in the Black Sea so far.
And at what point would you judge Russia to have lost its naval dominance of the Black Sea?
That's a good question. So, I mean, on the one hand, we could argue that the Russians have already, to some extent, lost the naval dominance in the Black Sea. They can't, for example, operate freely in the northwestern Black Sea anymore. But I think the question is to what extent what would need to happen for the Russian Black Sea Fleet to be incapable of meaningfully contributing to those three core missions of, blockade, long-range strike, and logistical support. In terms of the blockade, we may be seeing early signs that the tempo of commercial activity going through Odessa means that the blockade has, to a great extent, been circumvented already. Now, that could change, in particular, if the Black Sea Fleet and the wider Russian force is able to maintain persistent pressure on Odessa through things like air and missile strikes ashore, that may change the calculus of the commercial sector in terms of the movement of vessels through the region. So I think we need to track the data there. But there is certainly early evidence that the fleet is losing its ability to constrain Ukrainian exports, and it's certainly lost its ability to do things like stop, search, and board vessels en route to Odessa in a way that it attempted to do a few months earlier with a small patrol vessel against a Palawan cargo container, because the threat posed by Ukrainian land-based capabilities is just too substantial. I think in terms of the Black Sea Fleet's logistical role, the loss of a significant chunk of the Rapucha class sort of capability in the region is a significant loss for the Black Sea Fleet. Of course, it can the Russians. This doesn't mean that Russia's ability to supply its front lines is necessarily completely disrupted. They have other means of moving goods, but it is a significant loss, and in particular, a loss of the fleet's ability to contribute to that wider mission. I think in terms of the fleet's ability to conduct air and missile strikes with the caliber, that may be the function that's most difficult to disrupt for the Ukrainians, although they can certainly slow the tempo by forcing it to operate in a more distributed manner.
And that partial destruction of the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet headquarters, the confusion over the fate of its commander, Admiral Viktor Sokolov, it was a crushing blow at the time for President Putin. Is that headquarters of any use whatsoever to Russia now?
I mean, excuse me. Obviously, a headquarters in terms of a facility, may well be functionally compromised. Certainly, a building struck by a quite heavy missile like the Storm Shadow, which carries a substantial payload, may or may not be something that could be functionally useful. But of course, the headquarters is really more about the people who work within it, right? The staff officers who keep the fleet running, the commanders who dictate its operations. And I suppose to know how heavily that functionality was disrupted, we'd need to know a bit more about who was lost on that day by the Russian side. I haven't seen anything in terms of the fleet's activity, though, to suggest that it isn't able to function or that, command level functionality has been lost. So I would assume that the Russians have adjusted to that loss.
And in its alternative to Sebastopol, it signed this agreement, Russia, for the base in the breakaway Georgian region of Abkhazia. Can you just explain the kind of tensions this is creating and how far the development of that base has gone?
Sure. So in terms of Russia's decision to create a naval facility in Abkhazia, I'm not so sure it could really represent a stand-in for Sevastopol, although it gives the fleet an additional sort of node from which to operate in the Black Sea alongside its other secondary facilities like, Feodosia and Novorossiysk. But of course, the most significant aspect of this is political, right? Because of course, Abkhazia, along with South Ossetia, was one of the two breakaway regions that Russia severed from Georgia after its war against that nation in 2008. And the creation of a military facility there has the political effect of consecrating that sort of breakaway status, which Russia is backing as a sort of permanent political reality, which obviously has significant ramifications, both for the Georgians, but also for the sort of the precedent that that land cannot be easily, or ideally should not be easily severed from the nation that legitimately administers it.
And how far has that development gone? So, as far as you know.
As I understand, it's still relatively nascent. The creation of a full-fledged naval facility is a time-consuming activity, but depending on the level of ambition, the Russians may get to what their objective is there sooner or later.
And overland, Russia has been able to duplicate Ukraine's drone and counter programs relatively successfully. Why does it look like this hasn't happened in the Black Sea?
Well, I think it's more the question of what the incentive structures are for both nations, right? So in the Black Sea, the Ukrainians are essentially fighting a sea denial fight. They are a coastal, they're operating as a coastal force that is attempting to hold at risk disproportionately valuable platforms, warships, logistical vessels, and that sort of thing, with an economy of force capability. And there's no real Ukrainian analog that the Russians would need to strike with something like an uncrewed surface vessel. Most of the Ukrainian surface fleet was more or less entirely destroyed at the war's outset. Its last major combatant, the Yuri Oliferenko, was sunk in port last year. And so there's not really an obvious use case for maritime drones for the Russians in the maritime in the naval domain, in the way which is different from the land, where really there's a logic to both sides employing these capabilities.
And by extension, it has Ukraine's lack of a navy and by definition lack of sea targets actually put Russia at a disadvantage?
Well, yeah, in some ways it would probably have been easier for the Russians to cope with a smaller conventional Ukrainian Navy. In fact, they did at the war's outset, and with the last of it late last year. But the real challenge, of course, is that the Russian fleet now, for the Russians, is that they don't really have an obvious naval target. What they have is instead is a series of strikes by much more distributed capabilities, which are individually quite cheap and which the Russians cannot as easily disrupt.
And what lessons do you think will be learned from Ukraine's naval drone campaign? How much more a part of modern navies will they become?
So I think what naval drones have, on the one hand, naval drones have had a relatively low success rate. One should not overstate their effectiveness in the sense that against a well-defended vessel, to the extent that they've been used against them, they haven't been terribly successful either against the Grigorovich class frigate or even the intelligence gathering ship, the Ivan Kurs. They've also been quite vulnerable both to things like barriers, but also, helicopter fire, and naval gunfire, for example. But on the other hand, they are quite a cheap capability. As I said, something that costs in the range of hundreds of thousands of pounds, as opposed to an anti-ship cruise missile, which usually has a price tag in the millions. And B, they have quite an extended reach. Most anti-ship cruise missiles operate in the 150 to 250 kilometer range, whereas the Ukrainians have been able to use these USVs at much greater distances. I think the lesson there is that what the employment of these capabilities might allow is for vessels that might not have previously justified the use of an anti-ship cruise missile, things like a logistical vessel or a patrol vessel, to be targeted economically. And also for nations that don't have the reach to generate, or have either don't have the reach to use anti-ship cruise missiles at very long distances, or have a limited stock of long-range strike capabilities to generate strategic reach by other means. And that's a trend we've seen also with non-state actors. The Houthis use remote-controlled boat drones against the Saudi coalition back in 2016 as well. So I think what they are, alongside a range of other capabilities, one more means by which relatively weak actors in the maritime domain can generate some asymmetrical advantages that they might not have previously possessed.
Yeah, and Ukraine's victories at sea are often cited when anyone bemoans the lack of advances on the ground. And one of the most hotly contested areas right now is Avdiivka in the east. It's reportedly surrounded on three sides. How important strategically is Avdiivka, and why is Ukraine's new commander-in-chief deploying more troops to defend it?
Sure. So Avdiivka is regarded as strategically important by both the Russians and the Ukrainians for a few reasons. The first is its proximity to Donetsk, which the Russians seized in 2015. The second is the fact that it sits on an important railhead, and so its possession by the Russians would improve their ability to resupply their front lines. And finally, there's the fact that the city is a heavily defended and a very important part of Ukraine's defensive lines in the area, and its loss would potentially compromise the Ukraine's wider defensive efforts in that part of the front.
And the Institute for Strategic Studies, based in London, it's released data showing Russia has lost more tanks than it had active before the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion. How have Russia's losses degraded their fighting ability, and how successful are they in replacing material of the same quality and standard while under sanctions?
Sure. So, I mean, Russia's losses in armor have been very considerable over the course of the war, as you mentioned, and this has led to a qualitative degradation in Russian forces. You see more variants that were previously considered subpar, things like the T-80 sort of wheeled into service, as well as much older variants. Things like the T-62 essentially pulled out of stock and used on the front line. I think the Russians face kind of two pressures. On the one hand, as you said, they've lost a considerable sort of number of tanks, and on the other hand, they are actually growing their force, which creates a requirement to fit out new units with the capabilities they need to operate, which I think will inevitably result in a partial qualitative degradation of the Russian force. That's not to say that the Russians can't replace a large number of tanks of higher quality, things like the T-72B3, for example, of which they lost quite a large portion. But what it might mean is, like the rest of the Russian army, we will see the Russian armored force develop into a tiered structure where relatively high quality capabilities are reserved for a few units regarded as elite, whilst many other units are fitted out with capabilities that might be deemed subpar or expendable, as sort of reflecting their status in the Russian concept of operations.
And just to return to the sea for a moment, there was a lot of fanfare about the two mine hunters that Britain was gifting Ukraine, which were denied access to the Black Sea by Turkey. Is there any hope of them getting there while the war continues?
Yeah, so I think Turkey has argued that, as long as Article 19 of the Montreux Convention holds, it is obligated to deny both belligerents' naval vessels access to the Black Sea. And therefore, any decision to sort of soften that policy for one nation would undermine the principle of it upholding Montreux in a relatively even-handed way. I suspect that's likely to hold true for the duration of the war. There are some questions regarding the technicalities of the Montreux Convention. For example, if the two Ukrainian vessels were to nominally regard Odessa as their home port, there is a plausible legal argument that transit through the straits could be treated as a vessel returning to its home port, which is a caveat within the convention's restrictions on the transit passage of belligerent vessels. Their vessels are allowed to return to their home ports, but it isn't clear that the Turkish government subscribes to that interpretation. I think as things stand, their transit to the Black Sea seems unlikely.
How much support has the West given Ukraine in ending Russia's dominance in the Black Sea generally? If you could just give us an overview, and how important is that in the overall strategy of the war?
Sure. So I think there's a few aspects to it. So firstly, Western capabilities were quite important to reinforcing Ukraine's ability to achieve sea denial in the northwestern Black Sea, because although, the sinking of the Moskva was achieved with the Ukrainian capability, the Neptune, the capability had just about been fielded at the war's outset. In fact, the Ukrainians had only fielded one training sort of unit of Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles at the time. So the capacity to use these at scale didn't exist. And it was primarily sort of augmenting that sea denial system with Western missiles like the Harpoon, which made the northwestern Black Sea a more risky place for Russian vessels. The second aspect of this, obviously, is the impact that longer range strike capabilities, things like Storm Shadow, have had upon the ability of the Russian Black Sea Fleet to operate safely within Sevastopol. Something like Storm Shadow represents one of the few means by which the Ukrainians can penetrate what is a very robust Russian integrated air defense system around Sevastopol, and thereby allows the Ukrainians to pressure the Black Sea Fleet. There is also the question of intelligence gathering and to what extent situational awareness has been contributed to the Ukrainian effort. I think it's almost certain that this is the case to some extent, although, of course, the extent and the details are something we cannot know at this time. In terms of how important this is to the war effort, I mean, it is worth reiterating that the war in Ukraine is ultimately a land war with a maritime component. The maritime domain is important in a number of ways to the war's outcome. It's important. Sorry, go on.
No, go on. Sorry, I thought you
No,
stopped.
no. Oh, no. It's important in terms of, whether or not the Russians can readily disrupt Ukraine's critical national infrastructure with things like cruise missiles. It is an important supporting element in Russia's resupply. And of course, it's an important factor in terms of both Ukraine's ability to sustain its own economy with things like hard currency from exports, but also the negotiating position it enters in any post-war situation where its ability to sustain its economy will be one major factor in its ability to sustain itself as a nation. However, ultimately, these are all ancillary sort of considerations to the war on the land, which is ultimately where the fight will be won or lost.
And just finally, as someone who has studied sea power in depth, what have you learned from the first 2 years of this war?
So I think there's a few things we've learned from the first year of this war, and a few things perhaps which are a bit more ambiguous. So on the one hand, the vulnerability or the loss of the Moskva to an anti-ship cruise missile, might be interpreted as highlighting the vulnerability of large complex warships to comparatively cheap anti-access area denial capabilities, which an ever wider range of actors can field. However, equally, we should note that, in the Red Sea, we've seen the US Navy and its allies defend themselves quite effectively against similar systems like the Chinese C-802 missiles. So some of that may have reflected the poor sort of performance of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in terms of things like alertness of crews in the early stages of the conflict, as well as the fact that the Moskva itself as a vessel was due refits in a number of critical capability areas. So, there are ambiguous lessons learned there, but it's nonetheless true as a general statement that the range of tools with which an actor without a robust navy can challenge a stronger fleet is growing. I think the second lesson is the vulnerability of fixed infrastructure. Bases, for example, where we've seen even robustly defended bases like Sevastopol increasingly threatened by the Ukrainians. And that may not directly threaten fleets in every instance, but it does threaten their ability to perform their tasks, because ultimately the sustenance of a fleet and its ability to maintain a tempo of combat activity depends on fixed infrastructure. So although both sides have sometimes struggled to engage dynamic targets, fixed targets are a much easier thing to disrupt. And I think many fleets will find that the infrastructure upon which they depend to operate will increasingly be jeopardized. And this will be especially challenging in narrow seas and in littoral waters, where combatants and the infrastructure on which they depend are often operating at very close proximity. I think the third lesson is about the importance of second-tier capabilities, the uncrewed surface vessels, for example, to target those vessels which are extremely important to a fleet's functioning, logistical vessels, resupply vessels, those sorts of things, with a capability that's sufficiently cheap in order to justify their use against something that isn't a primary surface combatant. And, some of Ukraine's major successes in this campaign, the disruption of Snake Island by destroying, resupplies, the Cerner-class landing craft that we're resupplying it, or their destruction of the Rapucha-class landing vessels, have reflected a focus not so much on the combatants of the Black Sea Fleet, but the supporting elements, which are absolutely critical to both its ability to function and its ability to contribute to a wider campaign.
Really interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sidharth Kaushal. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.